and thank you very much for coming along this evening. This evening we're going to look at, in a sense, the eloquence of silence. It's a little abstract, but not very when you look at it. Stones don't speak, but a lot of things are written in stone. A lot of things that aren't actually speech are implied in stone structures. And that's one of the things we want to look at today, because one of the most enduring impacts historically for anybody who's been looking at the history of the slave trade is what's been left in Africa. So we're going to be looking at, in effect, written in stone, the whole question of the Eerie eloquence of what's left in the slaving castles and slaving forts of West Africa, which are visible from space. This is the odd sort of thing. No matter how you try to erase it, or don't write it down in the books, or lose it from memory, it's now observable from space in such a way that any intelligent organism from any other tradition would ask themselves what was going on in these structures that appear in Earth's history at a certain moment and then seem to be abandoned. The archaeologist in all of us would ask that kind of question. So we're going to look at it a little this evening. Talk about the silent and eerie eloquence of some enduring structures of the Atlantic slave trade. As I indicated, the structures are now visible from space. The U.S. Navy and intelligence services regularly scan the Earth's surface and make some of that available to commercial groups like Google Earth to make maps. And it's possible to view structures like these from above them with great detail. And in fact, you can zoom in on Google Earth and see them yourself. It's really quite extraordinary. We started to catalog some of these and document the history behind them in places like Fort Dix Cove in Ghana. This is all part of the African Historical Graphics Archive, which is trying to bring together the historical maps that have been made of these areas and the archaeological record on the one hand and the historical written record on the other. We have an extraordinary array of different kinds of resources now to bring to bear on this. And one of them are these views from space, which are very interesting and quite instructive if you start to use them as a kind of flyby. You can take a 360-degree view of this from above it and begin to ask some very interesting questions. These are beyond the purview of the expertise of any one person. This is why it's necessary to construct these new kinds of collections of data and information with several different linguistic traditions represented: Portuguese, Spanish, English, French, Dutch, even German and Swedish. In fact, it turns out that the Denmark, had forts that were quite active during the slave trade. And they too have left archaeological remains that can now be studied in detail. But one of the things you can do from space is take a look at the overall structure from above and then begin to ask some very interesting questions of it that you can ground truth in some sense. by showing up on the ground and start taking pictures. Taking pictures in an itinerary of some sort that allows you to see what was going on in different parts of this structure. Let's take it on the outside of the structure to begin with. Take a look at what the walls, in fact, look like from the outside. It's pretty extraordinary. These are not insignificant structures, viewable, as I say, from space, but quite imposing and intimidating on the ground. You can see that they're built in the tradition of European armed castles. And it's in that tradition that we begin to ask some very interesting questions, like, who are the architects behind these buildings? Who were employed to design them? What kind of structures did they have in mind? Are they entirely defensive? Or in fact, are they whole households within them, storing water, food, making preparations for gathering slaves and keeping them under coerced conditions until the next ships arrive? We can learn a lot by walking around the outside of things, and particularly look at the defensive capacity of these structures, not only to ward off any attacks from resistant groups on land, but also to ward off any danger of attack from the sea from rival Europeans. Let's take a look. If we once again view it from above and begin to penetrate the inside of the structure, you can see that we looked just briefly at that portion there, but if we look at some of the internal structures, they're equally interesting. Let's go here to the ramparts, which look out over the sea. And in fact, you can see some of the armaments that are deployed there, pointing out in two different directions in the sea. And if we in fact turn around the entire picture, you can see a very intricate and elaborate structure with moats, stairs, and dungeons, all guarded by outer flanks of cannons, in this case pointing out to the ocean to discourage any rival European group that might want to take control of this area. It's really quite an extraordinary artifact, left, as I say, visible from space, left for us to discover and analyze historically. What kinds of things were going on here? For how long did they go on? Who was in charge? What was it like inside these structures? You can actually walk around inside in an imaginative sense. And you can see the architecture involved here. This is not a casual mud hut. This is quite an elaborate structure of different rooms on an adjoining and opening courtyard with its own internal water drainage system that captures rainwater for the needs of the population, both free and enslaved, inside this castle. And you can walk to some extent around the thing, and in fact even into some of its inner rooms. In any case, the architecture is very identifiable and would be something where we'd need the expertise of European medieval architecture to help us understand what's going on. Where were the slaves kept? Where were the food supplies kept? Where was the cooking done? What kinds of volumes of people could be housed and, you might say, processed in their preparation for the transatlantic voyage here. Very interesting set of structures that you can look at as a student of architecture, as a student of military structures, as a student of late medieval castle building. Any one of these things needs to be brought together along with the historical documentation that was accompanying these different forts. I say accompanying them because they're all under the direction of particular corporate structures. The Dutch invented the joint stock company around the turn of the 17th century, and the other European countries were very quick to follow and join in with things like the Dutch West Indian Company, which was based on the Dutch East Indian Company. But the British and the French developed their own stock companies for handling the trade. Initially, it was under the control of royal authorities, and the royal authorities gave charters to these merchants to behave in certain ways. But eventually, the merchants took control and became dominant in the operation, such that they may require a royal charter, but the operation of these very intricate stations of trade passed over into the hands of the merchants themselves. If you look at some of these cannons, actually, you can learn a little bit about the military history of the area, because every one of them has an indication of the royal seal of the king involved. This happens to be the seal of King George III in England at the time of the late 18th century, when the United States became the United States. 13 colonies revolted against George III, and they would have been looking at the other end of these cannons in places like Boston and New York. But here in West Africa, they're used to keep at bay the French and the Dutch and the Danish rivals. Very interesting set of questions arises immediately in terms of how much manpower would it take to build a structure like this, viewable, as I say, from space. That can be quantified, and I'm sure architects would have a very interesting set of calculations to try to make sense of what might be called the energetics the energetics of construction. How would you construct such a multi-tiered operation without mechanical assistance, with only human labor, animal labor, wind, and solar? Very interesting set of problems. Could be solved by a team of archaeologists and building experts who could make a thorough assessment of this kind of thing. In any case, it's just part of what's made possible now because these structures are viewable from space. In addition, whole areas of the world are viewable from space, and you can call them up in Google Earth, like estuaries here in the Gambia in West Africa, and take a look at them. From these estuaries you can see a number of things and explore at great length the fact that this river goes to the interior very, very far. It's not navigable all the way, certainly not with seagoing ships, but canoes can work their way up this river system for quite a while. And the strategic points of this river turn out to be not only those on the shore, but those in the middle of the river itself, the islands that can be found in the middle of the river. You can find this out from looking carefully at the maps, which can be digitized and georeferenced as layers on top of the geo and the geological maps of contemporary Google Earth. When you scan in a map, you can georeference it and place it on top of the underlying substrata and take a look at what these things look like, in a sense, flying into them from space and laying them down on top of the underlying Earth, and then beginning to analyze things as you zoom into both the map and the underlying area. One of the things you'll realize very quickly is that the Europeans, in this case the English, were looking particularly at this part of that Gambia River for the importance of the isle indicated as James Island. In some texts it's indicated as St. James Island, but in any case it appears to have a structure on it, a structure that may in fact still be visible and accessible. That's one of the things that can be looked at now by, in effect, taking the substrate and looking at it without the map in between, and learning more about this from the texts, which can be called up one after another, the diagrams at the time, and the importance of that island for the Europeans establishing it. If you zoom into that, you can find out, in fact, a great deal about what's still remaining there, and the archaeology is very revealing in terms of what still is visible. These aren't as elaborate structures as the ones that are still intact along parts of the Gold Coast, but they are very revealing. Craggy rocks of stone, still visible and in fact analyzable on this island of St. James, which was a kind of stopping point for the European slavers as they brought the slaves to the coast and loaded them on transatlantic ships. People now visit the island and look at these old ruins, but it's somewhat inaccessible and hard to get to except by a small boat. In any case, you can keep looking at these kinds of things from a different vantage point now that you have both ground truth and distance truth. Similar castles are also visible along the Gold Coast that were under the control of other European powers, not the British in this case, but as you can see, there's still extraordinary details that can be obtained by looking carefully at the internal photos, even the current whitewashing of this castle. It's a very interesting castle in itself, and it's kind of being restored at this point, very elaborately. If you go through its structures, it's very impressive because it's a 5-story building built with a great many different kinds of structures that took a great many years to plan and deploy. So we'll pursue this as we get further into the study of the archaeology of the slave trade. Thank you very much. See you next week.